They said the mine made him the richest man in Red Valley, but no one ever asked who it belonged to before the gold was found. The wind moved slow that morning, dragging dust across the main street like it had all the time in the world, and Ethan Cole stood on the wooden porch of the saloon, one boot resting on the rail, watching men laugh with glasses raised in his name, the kind of laughter that comes easy when money starts flowing and harder questions stay buried, his hat casting a shadow over eyes that had learned long ago how to measure land, deals, and silence in equal parts, because out here, a man wasn't judged by what he found, but by what he kept. They had celebrated him for 3 nights straight, said he struck gold where no one else dared dig, said he turned dry rock into promise, said he made the town matter again. And maybe all of that was true. Maybe the mine did change everything, but not in the way they thought. She arrived without announcement, without escort, without the noise men usually needed to be noticed, just a single figure walking up from the edge of the road where the dust met the horizon, her steps steady, her presence quiet enough that most didn't see her until she was already there, standing in front of the saloon like she had always known where to go, her dark hair tied back, her eyes not searching, not wandering, just fixed on one thing, and one thing only. Ethan noticed her before anyone else did, not because she made a sound, but because she didn't, and silence has a way of cutting through celebration sharper than any shout. His hand paused halfway to his glass as he watched her approach, the boards beneath her feet creaking just once, like the building itself was acknowledging something the people inside were too distracted to feel. No one spoke to her, not at first, and no one welcomed her either, because she didn't carry the look of someone there to buy or beg. She carried something else, something older than the town, older than the mine, something that didn't belong to laughter or deals or gold. She stopped a few feet from Ethan, close enough that the dust between them settled, close enough that he could see the calm in her face, not fear, not anger, just certainty, the kind that doesn't need permission to stand where it stands. A few men turned, curiosity first, then smirks, then the low murmur that always follows when someone doesn't fit the shape a town expects. But she didn't react to any of it, didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge the weight of their stares, because her world wasn't built on their approval. Ethan straightened slowly, setting his glass down without breaking eye contact, the faint clink of it against the wood sounding louder than it should have, and for a moment, the laughter behind him faded into something thinner, something unsure, like the town itself was holding its breath without knowing why. She reached into the fold of her worn cloth and placed something small on the edge of the table beside him, not with force, not with hesitation, just a quiet, deliberate motion that carried more weight than anything said in the past 3 days. And when it touched the wood, even the wind seemed to pause, because some things don't need to be explained to be understood, they just need to be seen at the right moment. Ethan glanced down, just once, then back at her, his jaw tightening in a way no one else would notice, but she did, and that was enough. "You didn't find gold," she said, her voice steady, low, carrying across the porch without needing to rise. "You found something that was already here." The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that didn't ask to be believed, only heard, and somewhere behind Ethan, the laughter stopped completely, leaving nothing but the creak of wood, the soft scrape of boots, and the quiet realization that whatever story this town had been telling itself about that mine, it wasn't the only one. The object was no bigger than a man's palm, but it carried a weight that did not belong to its size, a flat piece of stone worn smooth by years that no one in that town had lived to count, its surface marked with lines too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be dismissed as coincidence. And yet to most eyes on that porch, it was just a rock, just another thing pulled from the same earth they had been digging into. Without question, without memory. Ethan did not touch it right away, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Not by the men behind him who had trusted his certainty, and certainly not by the woman standing in front of him who had already seen enough to know when doubt began to settle into a man's bones. One of the miners stepped closer, boots heavy against the wood, leaning in with a half-smile that carried more dismissal than curiosity. "That is what all this is about," he said, glancing between the stone and the girl as if the answer had already been decided. But she did not look at him, did not shift her stance, did not give him the satisfaction of acknowledgement, because whatever this moment was, It did not belong to him or to anyone else standing there. Ethan finally lowered his hand, fingers brushing against the surface of the stone, and something about the way it felt stopped him for just a second longer than expected. Not rough, not jagged, but shaped, intentional, like something that had been placed rather than formed. And he turned it slightly, catching the light just enough to see the faint lines carved into it, lines that crossed and curved in a pattern he could not read, but could not ignore either. "You are saying this proves something," he said, his voice steady, controlled, but quieter now, stripped of the easy confidence that had carried him through every deal he had ever made. And she nodded once, slow, certain, as if the truth did not need to be rushed. "It does not prove anything to you," she said, her eyes never leaving his, "because you were not meant to understand it." A few men behind him let out a low chuckle at that, the kind that comes from discomfort dressed up as humor, but it faded quickly when Ethan did not join them, when he did not turn away, when he did not dismiss her the way they expected him to, because out here, a man like him was supposed to know what belonged to him, supposed to recognize ownership the way he recognized the horizon, clear and unquestioned. And yet this was something else, something that did not fit into lines on a map or signatures on paper. The saloon doors creaked open behind them, and old Thomas Green stepped out. Into the light, slow and deliberate, his years showing in every step, but his eyes still sharp enough to catch what others missed. He had seen the town before the mine, before the rush, before men started measuring value in ounces instead of seasons. And when he saw the stone in Ethan's hand, something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition that settled deep and quiet. "Let me see that," Thomas said, not as a request, but as a habit formed long before anyone on that porch had learned to speak with authority. And Ethan handed it over without protest, his gaze drifting back to the woman as if the answer he needed was still standing in front of him rather than resting in someone else's hands. Thomas turned the stone slowly, tracing the lines with a finger that had spent decades reading land the way others read books. And for a long moment, he said nothing, just stood there with the weight of it, until finally he let out a breath that carried more history than words could hold. "I have seen marks like this before," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "Not in the mine, not in any claim, but out past the ridge, years ago, before anyone thought there was gold worth digging." The men shifted, unease spreading in small, quiet ways, boots adjusting, shoulders tightening, because the past was not something they had come here to honor. It was something they had come here to replace. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. "And what does it mean?" he asked, and Thomas looked at the stone again, then at the woman, as if asking permission without saying it, and she gave none, just stood there with the same calm certainty, letting the silence do its work. "It means," Thomas said slowly, choosing each word like it mattered, "that someone marked that ground long before we ever laid claim to it. Not for gold, not for profit, but for something we never bothered to understand." The wind picked up just enough to stir the dust again, carrying it between them, over the stone, over the porch, over the town that had built its future on something it had never truly looked at. And Ethan felt it then, not fear, not guilt, but the first real crack in a story he had believed without question, because if the ground beneath his mind had a history he did not know, then everything built on top of it might not belong to him at all. And for the first time since the gold had been found, the weight of it did not feel like victory. It felt like something waiting to be answered. The porch no longer felt like a place for celebration, and no one could say exactly when that shift happened, only that it did, quietly, the way a shadow moves when the sun dips just enough to change what a man can see. And Ethan Cole stood there with that same steady posture he had carried his whole life. But something beneath it had started to move, something slower, heavier, like a thought that refused to be ignored. The men behind him were not laughing anymore, not because they understood what the stone meant, but because they could feel that it meant something to him, and that alone was enough to make the air different. Ayanna did not rush him, did not press her claim. She simply remained where she was, her presence as still as the land she spoke for. And that stillness began to carry its own kind of pressure, the kind that does not force a man to act, but makes it harder for him not to. Ethan finally stepped down from the porch, boots landing in the dust with a dull, grounded sound, and for a moment, The town watched him the way they had the first time he struck gold, expecting direction, expecting certainty, expecting him to turn this into something simple, something they could understand and follow. But he did not speak right away, did not look at them. His attention stayed on her. "If what you are saying is true," he said slowly, each word measured like he was weighing it before letting it go, "then why come here now, after the mine has already been opened, after everything has already been decided?" It was not a challenge, not exactly, but it was not acceptance either. It was the kind of question a man asks when he is not ready to let go of what he believes, but cannot ignore what he is starting to see. Ayanna tilted her head just slightly, as if considering not the question, but the man asking it. And when she answered, her voice carried that same quiet certainty. "Nothing was decided," she said. "You only believed it was." The words did not rise, did not strike, but they settled in a way that made them harder to push aside, and Ethan felt that same weight again, not on his hands this time, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that had nothing to do with contracts or claims. Old Thomas stepped forward a little, still holding the stone, his eyes moving between them like he was watching something unfold that he had not expected to see again in his lifetime. And he cleared his throat softly, not to interrupt, but to remind them that the past does not stay buried just because men choose not to look at it. "There was talk," Thomas said, his voice low, careful, "years back, before this town grew the way it has, about land out past the ridge that no one would settle, not because it was barren, but because it was marked." A few of the men shifted again, some glancing toward the direction he spoke of, others avoiding it entirely, because there are stories every town carries that no one repeats unless they have to, and this was one of them. Ethan looked at Thomas now, not with impatience, but with focus. "Marked by who?" he asked, and Thomas did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at Ayanna again, and this time there was no question in his eyes, only recognition. "By people who were here before any of us," he said finally, "and they did not mark it for us to take." The wind picked up again, brushing against Ethan's coat, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and something older, something that had been there long before gold made men forget how to listen, and for the first time, he turned his gaze away from Ayanna and toward the distant ridge where the mine lay, a place he had come to see as his own, a place that now seemed to be holding something back, something he had never thought to ask about. "You should have come sooner," one of the men muttered from behind, his voice uncertain, as if saying it might restore some balance to the moment. But Ayanna did not turn, did not acknowledge him, because her words were not meant for those who needed comfort. They were meant for the one man who could change what came next. "We did not need to come sooner," she said, her eyes still on Ethan. "We needed you to see it now." That stopped something in him, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could point to, but enough that he did not respond right away. Enough that the silence stretched just a little longer than it should have, and in that silence, the town waited, not for an answer, but for a direction, because everything they had built here had been tied to his decisions, his confidence, his belief that the land beneath them had nothing to say. Ethan took a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he knows that whatever he says next will not just be heard, it will be followed, and he looked back at her, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at the way she stood apart from the others, but at the steadiness in her eyes, the absence of doubt, the kind of certainty that does not come from wanting something, but from knowing something has already been lost. "Show me," he said at last, not loud, not commanding, just clear enough that there was no mistaking it. And for a moment, no one moved, not the men, not Thomas, not even the wind seemed to carry forward, because that single choice, simple as it sounded, was the first step away from everything the town had believed was already settled, and Ayanna nodded once, turning toward the road that led out past the ridge, not waiting to see if he would follow, because she already knew that he would. The road out of town stretched long and pale under the afternoon sun, a narrow line carved through dry earth and scattered brush, and Ayanna walked it without hesitation, her steps steady, unhurried, as if she had traveled it many times before, even if the town behind them believed she had just arrived, and Ethan followed a few paces behind, not out of submission, not out of trust, but because something in him had shifted just enough to make standing still feel heavier than moving forward. The sounds of the town faded quickly, swallowed by distance and wind, leaving only the soft rhythm of boots against dirt and the occasional creak of leather. And for a while, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because some truths do not begin with words. They begin with what a man chooses to see when no one else is there to tell him what it means. The ridge rose slowly ahead, not steep, not imposing, just present, the kind of land most men would pass without a second glance unless there was something to be gained from it. And Ethan had passed it before, many times, riding out to inspect the edges of his claim, always focused on the ground that promised gold, never on the ground that offered none, or so he had believed. Ayanna slowed as they approached the base of the ridge, her hand brushing lightly against a weathered post driven deep into the earth, so worn by time that it almost disappeared into the landscape. And yet it stood, quiet and firm, as if it had been placed there with purpose that had nothing to do with marking a boundary for profit. Ethan noticed it now, really noticed it, the way the wood had aged differently from anything in town, the way it did not lean or crack the way abandoned things usually did. And he stepped closer, his fingers hovering near it before he finally touched it, feeling the grain beneath his skin, the years pressed into it. This was not put here recently, he said, more to himself than to her, and she nodded slightly, continuing forward without turning back, because she did not need to confirm what the land was already showing him. They climbed the ridge in silence, the sun pressing down steady and warm, the air thinner, clearer, and as they reached the top, the land opened up beyond it in a way Ethan had never taken the time to see, a wide stretch of ground that held no buildings, no fences, no signs of the kind of claim he had spent his life recognizing. And yet there was something there, something in the arrangement of the earth, the placement of stones, the subtle lines that ran through it like a pattern waiting to be. Read. Ayanna stopped at the center of it, standing still as the wind moved around her, and for a moment, Ethan did not step closer. He simply looked, letting his eyes adjust to something they had never been trained to see. And slowly, piece by piece, the ground began to reveal itself, stones placed in deliberate shapes, worn but not random, forming symbols that echoed the lines carved into the stone she had shown him, not identical, but connected, part of the same language that did not belong to contracts or surveys, but to memory. We do not mark land to own it, Ayanna said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without breaking the stillness of the place. We mark it to remember it. The words settled into the open space, and Ethan felt something shift again, deeper this time, because everything he had been taught, everything he had built his life on, told him that land was something to be measured, divided, claimed, but standing there, looking at something that had been marked long before his name had ever been written on paper, that idea began to feel smaller, thinner, like it had always been missing something he had never questioned. He stepped forward now, carefully, not out of fear, but out of a growing awareness that this place was not empty, that it held something that did not belong to him to disturb. And he crouched near one of the stones, brushing away a thin layer of dust to reveal the carved lines beneath, lines that matched the stone now resting in his pocket, lines that had been waiting there, silent, while men dug just beyond this ridge, searching for something else entirely. The mine is less than half a mile from here, he said, his voice quieter now, almost restrained, as if speaking too loudly might break something that could not be repaired, and Ayanna finally turned slightly, just enough for him to see her expression, calm, but not untouched by what this moment meant. Yes, she said, close enough that you could take everything beneath it and never see what stands beside it. The wind moved again, stronger this time, lifting dust into the air and carrying it across the marked ground, across the ridge, toward the direction of the mine, and Ethan followed it with his eyes, seeing the distance differently now, not as a measure of land to be claimed, but as a space between what he had believed and what had always been there, waiting. He stood slowly, the weight of the place settling into him in a way no amount of gold ever had. And for the first time since he had taken ownership of that mine, he did not feel certain of anything at all, only aware that the ground beneath his success might not be his to stand on. And that realization did not come with anger or denial. It came with something quieter, something heavier, the beginning of understanding that some things are not lost because they disappear, but because no one chooses to see them until it is too late. The place did not ask for anything from him. And that was what unsettled Ethan the most, because every piece of land he had ever known demanded something in return: work, money, control. But this ground offered nothing and yet felt complete in a way his mind never had. And he stood there longer than he realized, the wind moving around him, carrying the faint sound of distant tools from the direction of the mine. A reminder that while he was here learning to see, others were still digging. Without question, Iana stepped past him, her feet finding a path through the marked stones as if it had been laid out for her long before he arrived. And she stopped near a larger formation at the center, a circle of weathered rocks half buried in the earth, each one placed with a precision that spoke of intention rather than chance. And she knelt slowly, brushing away dust with careful hands, revealing more of the pattern beneath. Ethan watched her for a moment before moving closer, not rushing, not speaking, just following the quiet pull of something he could not yet name. And when he reached the circle, he saw it clearly for the first time, lines etched into the surface of the stones, faint but still present, forming a design that connected them all, not random marks, but a language carried through time, one that had not needed paper or signatures to endure. "This is not a boundary," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant to disturb the stillness. And Iana shook her head gently, her fingers tracing one of the carved lines with a familiarity that did not need explanation. "It is not meant to keep people out," she replied. "It is meant to remind us where we stand." Ethan let that settle, his eyes moving across the formation again, seeing not just the stones, but the care behind them, the intention that had placed each one exactly where it needed to be. And for a moment, he tried to imagine the men who had done this, not as owners, not as settlers, but as something else entirely, something that did not see land as something to be taken, but as something to be understood. The thought did not come easily to him. It resisted, pushed against everything he had learned, but it did not disappear either. It stayed, quiet and persistent, like the marks beneath the dust. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small stone she had given him, turning it in his hand before placing it gently within the circle, aligning it with the pattern he now recognized. And the moment it settled into place, something about the formation felt whole in a way that was difficult to explain, as if a missing piece had been returned after years of absence. Iana watched him, not with approval, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, as if this was not a gesture meant to impress, but one that mattered because he had chosen to see what it meant. "The gold you found," she said after a moment, her voice softer now. "It sits beneath this place, not beside it." Ethan's head lifted slightly at that, his gaze shifting from the circle to the direction of the mine, and the distance between them felt shorter now, not measured in miles, but in understanding. "You are saying the mine cuts into this," he said, and she nodded once, her expression unchanged. "It cuts through what we marked, through what we remember, and every piece taken from it carries that with it, whether you know it or not." The words did not accuse, did not demand. They simply existed, and that made them harder to ignore, because there was no anger in them, no attempt to force him into guilt, only a truth presented without weight, leaving him to decide what it meant. Ethan stood slowly, the stone circle at his feet, the mine beyond the ridge, and the space between them no longer empty, but filled with something he had never accounted for. And he felt the shift again, stronger now, not just doubt, but responsibility, not given, not imposed, but recognized. He turned back toward the ridge, his eyes narrowing slightly as he traced the line of land that led to the mine, seeing it now as something connected, not separate. And for the first time, he understood that what he had claimed as his success might be built on something he had never had the right to take. The wind moved again, lifting dust from the ground and carrying it through the circle, across his boots, and toward the distant sound of work that had not yet stopped. And Ethan closed his hand slowly, the feeling of the stone still lingering in his palm even after he had let it go. And he realized then that this was not a matter of proof or argument. It was a matter of choice, not about what he could claim, but about what he was willing to return. And that choice did not come with noise or pressure. It came quietly, like everything else in this place, waiting for him to decide what kind of man he was going to be when no one else told him what was right. The walk back felt longer, though the distance had not changed, and Ethan could not tell if it was the weight of what he had seen or the silence that followed it that made each step settle deeper into the ground beneath him. Because once a man begins to see something he has ignored, the world does not return to the way it was before. It shifts, quietly, and everything familiar starts to carry a question it never held before. Ayana walked beside him now, not ahead, not behind, just present, her pace steady, her gaze forward, as if the path itself did not need to be reconsidered, only the man walking it. The ridge fell away behind them, and the sounds of the mine began to rise again, faint at first, then clearer, the steady rhythm of tools striking rock, the distant call of men coordinating their work, the kind of sound that once filled Ethan with a sense of progress, of purpose, but now it carried something else, something closer to interruption, like a voice speaking over something that had already been said. He slowed as they approached the edge of the operation, the ground shifting from untouched earth to marked paths, wagon tracks cutting lines into the soil, wooden supports rising where the entrance to the mine opened into. Shadow, and men moved through it all with practiced efficiency, unaware that anything beyond their work had changed. One of the foremen spotted him and straightened immediately, wiping dust from his hands as he approached, a look of expectation already forming. Because when Ethan came out here, it usually meant decisions, instructions, movement forward. We hit a stronger vein about 20 feet deeper this morning, the man said, his voice carrying a note of pride. Should double the yield by next week if we keep pace. Ethan nodded once, the words reaching him, but not landing the way they once would have, his eyes drifting past the man toward the entrance, toward the place where the earth had been opened without question. Stop digging, Ethan said. The words were not loud, but they cut through the noise in a way that made the foreman pause, confusion replacing confidence in an instant. Sir, the man replied, unsure if he had heard correctly. We just found the richest section yet. Ethan did not raise his voice, did not repeat himself with force. He simply held the man's gaze, steady, certain in a different way than before. I heard you, he said, and I am telling you to stop. The foreman hesitated, glancing past him, as if looking for confirmation that this was some kind of test, some adjustment in strategy he had not been told about. But there was none, only the same quiet certainty that now stood where confidence once had. Around them, the sounds began to shift, not stopping all at once, but slowing, uneven, as men noticed the pause, the break in rhythm, tools lowering just slightly, conversations fading into uncertainty. Ayana remained where she was, a few steps back, her presence still as ever, not stepping forward, not speaking, because this was not her moment to take, it was his to choose. We cannot just leave it, the foreman said carefully, not defiant, but concerned. We have men counting on this, the town is built on it now. Ethan let that sit for a moment, because it was true, the town had grown around the promise of this mine. Men had come here with nothing and found work, found purpose, and he had been the one to offer it, the one they trusted to keep it going. He turned slightly, looking out over the spread of the operation. The wagons, the tools, the men waiting for direction, and then beyond it, past the ridge, to the place that did not demand anything from him. And he understood then that the choice in front of him was not between profit and loss. It was between what was easy to continue and what was right to acknowledge. The ground we are digging into, he said slowly, his voice carrying just enough for those nearest to hear. It was not empty when we found it. The words did not explain everything, did not lay out the full truth, but they did not need to, because the change in him was already enough to tell them this was not a passing thought. The foreman frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in confusion. Land is never empty, he said, trying to find footing in something familiar. But it is claimed now. It is yours. Ethan shook his head once, small, deliberate. That is what I believed, he replied. But believing something does not make it true. The wind moved through the site, carrying dust across the open ground, brushing against boots, against wood, against the entrance of the mine itself. And for a moment, everything seemed to pause, not because they understood, but because they felt that something had changed, something that could not be pushed aside with work or noise. Ethan stepped forward then, past the foreman, toward the entrance, his boots slowing as he reached the edge of the shadow, and he looked down into it, into the place where the gold had been pulled from the earth, where his success had taken shape, and for the first time, he did not see it as something he had discovered. He saw it as something he had interrupted. He stood there for a long moment, then turned back to the men, his expression steady, not hard, not uncertain, just resolved in a way that did not ask for approval. "We are done here," he said, and this time, there was no hesitation in his voice at all. No one moved at first, not because they did not hear him, but because they did, and the meaning of those words did not fit into anything they had prepared themselves to understand, and for a moment, the entire operation stood suspended between what had been said and what it would mean to obey it. The foreman looked at Ethan again, searching for some sign that this was temporary, that there was still a version of the man he knew standing in front of him, the one who measured success in output and time, not in silence and restraint, but what he saw instead was something steadier, something that did not bend to expectation. "You are shutting down the entire mine," the foreman said slowly, as if repeating it might change its shape, and Ethan did not hesitate. "Yes," he answered, and that single word carried more finality than any order he had ever given. Around them, the men began to lower their tools fully now, not out of agreement, but because uncertainty had replaced routine, and routine is the first thing to fall when a man stops knowing what comes next. A murmur spread, low and uneven, questions without answers, glances exchanged between men who had come here for work and now found themselves standing in the middle of something they did not understand. One of them stepped forward, older than the rest, his hands worn from years of labor, his voice not angry, but firm with the weight of responsibility. "We came here because you said there was a future in this ground," he said, not accusing, not pleading, just stating something that had once been certain. "You gave your word." Ethan met his gaze, not turning away, not deflecting, because that was the part that mattered most, not the gold, not the land, but the trust he had built with men who had nothing else to hold on to. "I did," he said, "and I believed it when I said it." The man waited, expecting something more, something that would restore the balance, but Ethan did not offer comfort. He offered truth. "But I was wrong." The words landed harder than any denial could have, because they did not argue, they did not defend, they simply stood there, and in a place where certainty had been the foundation of everything. Admitting otherwise felt like pulling the ground out from under all of them. A few men shifted, uneasy, some looking toward the mine as if it might still hold the answer, others looking toward Ethan, waiting for him to take the words back, to turn this into something they could continue, but he did not. Ayanna remained at the edge of it all, her presence quiet, her eyes moving across the men, not judging, not demanding, only witnessing, because this moment was not about proving anything to them. It was about whether one man would hold to what he had seen when it cost him something real. The foreman exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face as he tried to understand the shape of what came next. "Then what happens to us?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a question that carried weight beyond himself, and Ethan did not answer right away, because the truth was, he did not have a clear path laid out, no plan drawn in advance, only a direction that had become impossible to ignore. He looked back toward the ridge again, toward the place where the stones rested in quiet patterns that had outlasted everything built around them, and then back at the men who had trusted him to lead them forward. "You will be paid for the work you have done," he said, his voice steady. "Every man here will leave with what he has earned." That brought a different kind of silence, not relief, not acceptance, but recognition that he was not walking away from them, even as he was walking away from the mine. "And after that?" the older man asked, and Ethan held his gaze, not offering false certainty, not pretending to know more than he did. "After that," he said, "you choose your own ground." The wind moved through them again, lifting dust from the paths carved by wagons, softening the edges of what had been made. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the answer was not easy, not comforting, but it was honest, and honesty has a way of settling deeper than promises ever could. The foreman nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding, and turned to the men, his voice carrying across the site with the authority of someone who had spent years turning chaos into order. "You heard him," he said, "pack it in." The words moved through the group, not fast, not eager, but steady, and one by one. The sounds of work shifted into the sounds of stopping, tools set down, wagons adjusted, men gathering what they had brought with them. And as the rhythm of the mine faded, something else took its place, something quieter, something closer to the land itself. As if it had been waiting for the noise to fall away. Ethan stood still as it happened, watching not the gold, not the entrance, but the men, because this was the cost of the choice he had made, not measured in ounces or dollars, but in the lives that had been tied to what he had started, and he did not look away from it, did not step back from it. He let it settle, fully, because anything less would have meant he had not truly seen what needed to be seen. Ayanna took a single step forward then, not toward the mine, not toward the men, but toward him, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not a smile, not approval, but something quieter, something like recognition, as if the man standing in front of her was no longer the same one she had walked into town to face, and that, more than anything else, was enough. By late afternoon, the mine no longer sounded like a place of promise. It sounded like something being put to rest, the steady rhythm of work replaced by quieter movements, the shifting of crates, the soft clink of tools being gathered, the low murmur of men speaking not about what they had found, but about where they would go next, and the dust that had once hung thick in the air began to settle, drifting back to the ground as if it had been waiting for the noise to end. Ethan stood at the edge of it all, not directing, not correcting, simply present, watching the shape of something he had built begin to change without trying to stop it, because for the first time, he understood that not everything a man starts is meant to continue. Ayanna remained nearby, her gaze moving across the land, not searching, not measuring, just taking in what was there, and for a while neither of them spoke, because the moment did not need words, it needed time. The foreman approached again, slower this time, his posture no longer carrying the urgency of work, but the weight of completion, and he stopped a few feet from Ethan, removing his hat in a small, respectful motion that did not need to be explained. "We will have everything cleared by sundown," he said, his voice steady. "Nothing left behind that does not belong." Ethan nodded once, understanding the meaning beneath the words, not just the clearing of tools, but the recognition that this ground was no longer something to be worked, but something to be left as it was found. "Thank you," Ethan replied, and the foreman hesitated for just a moment, as if there was something else he wanted to say, something about the uncertainty ahead, but instead he simply nodded and turned back to the men, because some things are better carried quietly than spoken aloud. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the site, stretching the outlines of wagons and posts into something softer, something less defined, and as the light changed, so did the feeling of the place, no longer sharp with purpose, but calm, almost still, like a breath finally released after being held too long. Ethan walked toward the entrance one last time, his boots slow against the dirt, and he stopped just before the shadow reached his feet, looking into it not with pride, not with regret, but with understanding, seeing now not what he had gained from it, but what had been there before he arrived, and what would remain after he left. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small set of keys, worn from use, simple in design, the kind of thing that holds no value on its own, but carries meaning because of what it opens, and he held them for a moment, feeling their weight, not heavy, but familiar, then turned and walked back toward the open ground where the men had gathered. The foreman noticed him approach and stepped forward again, the others falling quiet behind him, because even without words, they knew this moment mattered. Ethan stopped in front of him and extended his hand, placing the keys into the foreman's palm, closing the man's fingers around them gently. "Lock it," he said, his voice calm, "and do not open it again." The foreman looked down at his hand, then back at Ethan, and this time there was no confusion, only understanding, and he nodded once, firm, accepting not just the task, but what it meant. Behind them, the last wagon was being loaded, the final pieces of equipment secured, and the men began to move out slowly, not in a rush, not in frustration, but in quiet acceptance, each step carrying them away from something they had believed would define their future and towards something unknown. Ayanna stepped closer now, her presence no longer at the edge, but beside him, and she looked out over the land as the last of the men began their descent back toward the town. the dust rising lightly beneath their feet before settling again behind them. "You did not have to do this," she said, not as a question, not as a challenge, just as a statement of fact, and Ethan kept his eyes on the horizon, the fading light, the ridge beyond which the stones rested in silence. "I know," he replied, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty left to weigh against the decision, only a quiet acceptance of what had been chosen. The wind moved through them again, softer now, carrying the cooler air of evening, and for a moment, everything felt still, the kind of stillness that does not come from emptiness, but from balance, as if the land itself had shifted back into place. The foreman walked past them on his way out, the keys now resting in his pocket, his steps steady, and as he passed, he gave Ethan a small nod, not of agreement, not of approval, but of respect, the kind that is not asked for, and cannot be bought. Ethan watched them go until the last figure disappeared over the rise, until the sound of movement faded completely, leaving only the quiet stretch of land, untouched once more, and he let out a slow breath, not of relief, but of recognition, because what remained now was not something he had created, it was something he had chosen not to take any further. Ayanna turned slightly then, her gaze resting on him for a moment, and though she did not smile, there was something in her eyes that had not been there before, something that spoke not of victory, but of understanding, and without another word, she began to walk back toward the ridge, her steps light, her path clear, and this time, Ethan did not hesitate, he followed. The ridge looked different in the evening light, softer, quieter, as if the land itself had exhaled after a long day of being disturbed, and Ethan walked it with a pace that no longer belonged to a man chasing anything, but to one who had already decided where he stood, his boots pressing into the dirt without urgency, without claim, just presence. Ayanna reached the top first and stopped near the circle of stones, her silhouette outlined against the fading sky, and for a moment she did not move, as if giving the land time to settle back into itself before anything else was said or done. Ethan stepped up beside her and looked out across the open ground, the place where the markings rested unchanged, untouched, and beyond it, the faint outline of the mine now silent. Its purpose ended not by force, but by choice. The wind moved gently through the space between them, carrying the cool of approaching night, and it felt different now, not sharp, not restless, but steady, like something returning to its natural rhythm. Ethan let his gaze drift back to the stones, to the pattern he had not seen before this day, and he crouched down once more, his hand brushing lightly over the surface of one of them, not to uncover anything new, but simply to feel what had always been there, and for the first time, the gesture did not come with curiosity, it came with respect. "This place," he said quietly, not looking at her, not needing to. "It was never hidden." Ayanna nodded once, her eyes on the same ground. "No," she replied. "It was only ignored." The words settled easily now, without resistance, without the need to argue or explain, because what he had needed to understand had already found its place within him. Ethan stood slowly, the weight he had carried when he first climbed this ridge no longer pressing in the same way, not gone, but changed, no longer something to resist, but something to carry forward with intention. He reached into his coat again, not for the keys this time, but for the small stone she had given him, and he turned it in his hand for a moment before placing it back within the circle, aligning it carefully with the others, completing the pattern once more, and when he stepped back, there was no sense of giving something away, only of returning it to where it belonged. Ayanna watched him, and this time there was no distance in her gaze, no guarded stillness, only a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words to confirm. The sky shifted slowly toward dusk, the last light stretching across the land before fading, and the first hint of evening settled over the ridge, bringing with it a deeper silence, the kind that does not feel empty, but full, like a story finally told the way it was meant to be. Ethan looked out one last time toward the town in the distance, the place that had called him its richest man just that morning, and he knew that title would not follow him into what came next, not in the way it had before, and he did not try to hold on to it, did not measure what he had lost against what he had found, because for the first time, he understood that some things are not meant to be compared. "What happens now?" he asked, not because he needed direction, but because he recognized that this story did not belong to him alone. And Ayana took a slow breath, her eyes lifting briefly to the horizon before returning to the ground beneath them. "Now," she said, her voice calm, certain, "it is left as it was meant to be." Ethan nodded once, the answer simple, but complete, and he turned slightly, stepping away from the circle, not out of distance, but out of understanding that his place was no longer within it, and he let the space remain untouched behind him. Ayana stayed where she was for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly on one of the stones, not claiming, not holding, just present, and then she straightened and stepped back as well, leaving the formation whole, undisturbed, exactly as it had been before any of this began. They stood side by side in the quiet that followed, not speaking, not needing to, because some endings are not marked by words, but by the absence of them, and the land stretched out before them, unchanged, unbroken, carrying its meaning without asking to be seen. The wind moved once more, brushing gently across the stones, across the ridge, across the space where the mine had once echoed with sound, and it carried nothing with it now, no dust, no noise, only the quiet presence of something that had endured, something that did not need to be owned to matter. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes steady, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been before, and without another word, he turned and began to walk back down the ridge, not as the man who had come to claim the land, but as one who had learned to leave it, and behind him, the stones remained, silent, complete, and untouched, holding their place beneath the fading light as if they had never been disturbed at all.